Hi, welcome to Chelmsford Baptist Church Sunday Notebook Online, which is just kind of Sunday morning ramblings. It's like the trial sermon. It's good to see you. We're currently looking at the book of Corinthians. Now, as if you know me, you know I normally avoid the epistles, as we like to call them, or the letters, or as I like to call them, the difficult bits after the Gospels. Because I'm not saying other people aren't, obviously, because that would be judgmental. I'm a big Jesus fan. As my kids say, I'm a Jesus fanboy. And that's where I return to. But anyway, apparently you're meant to read the rest of the Bible as well every now and then. So when I'm not reading about Jesus, I do read other bits of the Bible. I mean, I read other stuff as well. I enjoy novels. Don't really like poetry. I do read some theology every now and then just to make sure my brain still works. Read the paper. Anyway, you don't really need to list everything. I read labels because I tend to do the washing. Anyway, that's not... Anyway, we're looking at 1 Corinthians. And this week, 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Now, I would have liked to have got someone else to read it, but I haven't. So I'm going to do it. So 1 Corinthians 12, I'm using the Message translation, which not everyone likes. Usually, the more conservative you are, the less you like it. I think at one end you've got, probably the Manga Bible. I don't know, perhaps the conservative Christians do like the Manga Bible, I don't know. Well, at one end you've got this, and the other end you've got the King James Version. And you can see how conservative someone is by how far towards the King James Version they are. That's my spot a person's theology in a nutshell tip there. You can have that. That's a hot take on how to tell someone's theological persuasion. Anyway, 1 Corinthians 2. Let's just crack on with it, shall we? And you'll remember that Corinthians is a letter sent to the church in a place called Corinth. That's why they were Corinthians. So Paul's writing this. You'll remember, friends, that when I first came to you to let you in on God's masterstroke, I didn't try to impress you with polished speeches and the latest philosophy. I deliberately kept it plain and simple. First Jesus and who he is, and then Jesus and what he did. Jesus crucified. I was unsure how to go about this and felt totally inadequate. I was scared to death, if you want the truth of it. And so nothing I said could have impressed you or anyone else. But the message came through anyway. God's Spirit and God's power did it, which made it clear that your life of faith is a response to God's power, not some fancy mental or emotional footwork by me or anyone else. We, of course, have plenty of wisdom to pass on to you once you get your feet on firm spiritual ground. But it's not popular wisdom, the fashionable wisdom of high-priced experts that'll be out of date in a year or two. God's wisdom is something mysterious that goes deep into the interior of his purposes. You won't find it lying around on the surface. It's not the latest message, but more like the oldest. What God determined as the way to bring out his best in us, long before we ever arrived on the scene. The experts of our day haven't got a clue about what his eternal plan is. If they had, they wouldn't have killed the master of the God-designed life on a cross. That's why we have this scripture text. No one's ever seen or heard anything like this. Never so much as imagined anything quite like it. What God has arranged for those who love him. But you've seen and heard it, because God by his Spirit has brought it all out into the open before you. The Spirit, not content to flit around on the surface, dives into the depths of God and brings out what God planned all along. Whoever knows what you're thinking and planning except you yourself? The same with God, except that he not only knows what you're thinking, he only knows what he's thinking, he lets us in on it. God offers a full report on the gifts of life and salvation that he's giving us. We don't have to rely on world's guesses and opinions. We didn't learn this by reading books or going to school. We learnt it from God. who taught us person to person through Jesus, and we're passing it on to you in the same first-hand and personal way. The unspiritual self, just as it is by nature, can't receive the gifts of God's Spirit. There's no capacity for them. They seem like so much silliness. Spirit can only be known by Spirit. God's Spirit and our spirits in open communion. Spiritually alive, we have access to everything God's Spirit is doing and can't be judged by unspiritual critics. Isaiah's question, is there anyone around who knows God's Spirit? Anyone who knows what he's doing has been answered. Christ knows, and we have Christ's Spirit. Now that does get a bit confusing at times, and this is why I'm a fan of the Gospels. So what I always suggest to people, if you think, well, that's a bit odd, try it in a different translation. The Good News, you could try the King James, the NIV, that's New International Version. And there's lots of versions that you can try. Try it in the original Greek. No, I don't recommend that. Anyway, try different versions, because what people are trying to do, here's something written in an ancient version of Greek. And the translator's trying to say, well, what's he trying to get across? What's he trying to say here? So sometimes they rephrase it differently, because literal translations, literally, aren't always literally helpful. Anyway, it's good stuff. Some people think, right, that the cleverer you are, the better Christian you are. And they go on this basis because if you're clever, right, if you're clever, you understand God better. Well, that's not how God works, as Paul says. And these two chapters of Corinthians, chapter 1, chapter 2, have both talked about what's regarded as clever or important and what God regards as clever or important. And they are different things. Now, I'd like to clarify a difference in how I see the universe working, and to explain the words I use, because we are kingdom people. If you're a follower of Jesus, you're a kingdom person. You're citizens of God's kingdom. And our values, if you're a kingdom person, are the values of Jesus. Faith, hope, love, grace, compassion, tolerance. You know. These are the things Jesus is like, and these are the things we should be looking for if people claim to be followers of Jesus. Not so we can work out whether they are or not. We're going to say, well, actually, you don't seem like Jesus. Or better still, well, actually, you do seem like Jesus. Anyway, in contrast to this, I sometimes use the phrase the world, the world's values, and the world says this, and the world says that, by which I mean kind of everything else. The people around us, social media, the news, our communities, international stuff, all these things of the world. Now, sometimes people talk as though the world is all bad. And the kingdom, obviously, is all good. Well, I believe, obviously, that the kingdom is all good. Well, it's good news for most people. And the world, therefore, is bad. That's not the case. The world has a different take on things. But the world is the world that God created, and it operates in a different way now, because the world, if you look at our theology through the Bible, has kind of turned its back on God. So some bits still work, right? There is still love, hope, grace, tolerance. It's still there. Goodness, beauty. It's still there. Light, joy. It's all still there. But there's other bits, other influences that are coming in. So anyway, so the world has different values to God's kingdom as a rule. Because beauty is very outward if you look at the way the world looks, isn't it? Beauty is about what you look like, that's it. Success is about money and power. Cleverness is about knowing facts. You're clever because you've got a certificate. You're clever because, you're good in a quiz. You're clever because you can outwit other people. Now, not everyone agrees with that, but generally speaking, that is how the world perceives things. But we are called to be different, to live with different values. And this is what Jesus talks about when he talks about the kind of upside down kingdom where the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And what seems least important is actually most important. This is what God is talking about. So when I say the world, that's my shorthand really for the kind of things that are generally accepted and the king, as opposed to the kingdom things. I am by no means criticizing the world because God made it. And generally speaking, I think he's done a very good job. It's beautiful. Anyway, so get back to the plot. Paul says, well, I'm not very impressive. Not me. He says, he isn't. He didn't use big words or complex arguments. He was scared, he says. When I came to you, I was scared. I just came to you with Jesus in my heart and God's Spirit as my guide. And that was it. That's all I had. And in verse 6, he talks about a different type of wisdom, a hidden wisdom. And I think he's right. He'll be pleased to know. We have to discover this wisdom for ourselves, don't we? If we're lucky, we're told about goodness and shown goodness and love and grace, maybe in our upbringing or our friends, in our church family. But the world at large generally doesn't value these things. If you look at the news or your screen, it's not very full of these things like goodness and love and grace. Look at the newspapers. It's full of fast cars and fast relationships and wealth and enhanced bodies and things that we should be aspiring to and fancy dresses that people wear that are worth hundreds of thousands while, just down the street, people are going hungry. The screens tell us the world, this is what's important. And we look around and we think, well, actually, I don't know. Even at my age, we have to learn to re-see the world. I have to remind myself what is really important, what is really of value, because I start doing stuff and then I start thinking, well, why am I doing this? It's not that important. Truth and beauty and love and grace and goodness, they're often drowned out by the noise of war or the noise of traffic. They're not lost, but they are hidden. And this is the hidden wisdom, I think, that Paul is alluding to. Now, the main drive of this section of the letter is emphasizing that contrast between those who have God's Spirit and those who don't. And I was having an interesting conversation, funnily enough, with someone earlier this week about the source of goodness, not the source of goodness. And is that goodness of God, even if the person who has that goodness doesn't acknowledge God? Can we be godly even if we don't know who God is? It's a good question. I mean, I think it's an easy question, but it's a good question. Some Christians would tie themselves up in knots over it. But I think the answer, you'll be pleased to know, I'm going to tell you what I think the answer is. I think the answer is yes, because God isn't just restricted to Christians. God isn't stuck to only work in the church. I mean, for goodness sakes, we invented the church, not God. God isn't going to say, oh, you made a nice church, I'll come and live in that. And no, I can't do anything outside of that now. The Old Testament is part of the explosion within the Old Testament is them discovering that God isn't just this God on a mountain who can't leave that geographical point. He's not some tribal God. Part of the discovery they make in the Old Testament is God is the God of the universe. And because of that, there are no other gods. They start off by going, God's a bit jealous of his rivalry. By the time you reach the Old Testament, there's no other gods. It's just bits of stone or wood that you worship, or digital images in our case. They're not real gods. So I think the answer is we can show goodness and see goodness that is of God, even if we don't know who God is, because God permeates everything. His goodness is seen throughout the earth. But Paul is saying, if we have a greater awareness of God, it means that we can see things differently. We see things from a different perspective. And other people won't understand that. Why do that? Why are you helping them? Why do you worship? What's this deal with the Bible? All these questions that we face as followers of Jesus. And they aren't bad questions. They aren't challenges to us. We are not being persecuted. It's good for us to think about these things and to have some answers. But, and here's the thing, we have some answers to those sorts of questions. You know, why do you worship? Why are you helping these people? What is it all about? What's the deal with God? We have an answer, but they don't make any sense. And this is Paul's point. Jesus doesn't make any sense to people who don't get the kingdom. Unless you see the world from God's perspective, Jesus doesn't make any sense at all. It's a big step for us. But one of the things that happens when we allow Christ to transform us is we can start asking the questions. So how about that? How about asking those questions of ourselves? Why? Why shouldn't we welcome refugees into our country? Why do you think it's okay to profit by destroying the planet? These are the questions we can start asking from God's point of view. Because people say to us, as followers of Jesus, why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? We can ask the questions. Why should politicians be allowed to exploit their position and power? Why do you call me stupid just because I don't have a qualification that you happen to think is important? Why do you call me ugly just because I don't look like the stereotypes on the screen? Why should you treat me like a second-class citizen? Or why should you treat that person like a second-class citizen just because they're female or gay or poor and so on? You see, all these questions that people go, well, that doesn't make any sense. We can start asking them because when we start seeing the world from God's point of view on what justice and joy and shalom are about, we can start asking those questions. Well, why not? Why is that happening? Why is it like this? Because we know, we've talked about this a lot, the default position is love. The default position is God made the world to be a good place. Goodness is the default. It's not, well, what do you expect? We're going to have war. What do you expect? They're going to let you down. Why is that? That's not the case. What do you expect? Goodness is what I expect. Because that's what I see from God's perspective. Those critical voices in your head and in the airwaves, well, they're from a different world to the ones that we inhabit as followers of Jesus. Now, I'm not saying escape to La La Land and have nothing to do and don't listen to and don't watch the telly and don't read the paper and live in this Christian bubble. What I'm saying is listen to what God's Spirit is saying to you. Because she speaks words of peace and healing and challenge. Listen to what Jesus is saying to you because he is your King. And he speaks words of affirmation and acceptance and hope and, yes, challenge to follow him. Paul picks up on this great debate that's now phrased in terms of science versus religion. I mean, that's a relatively new invention. It's probably 2 or 3 centuries old, that debate. He says some things are spiritual and can only be judged and valued on a spiritual basis. And whatever you may believe about God, some things are spiritual, whether you believe there's a divine spiritual or not. Spiritual is the only word you can use to describe love and beauty and honour and endeavour. They are not scientific, and they cannot be measured scientifically. But they're real, and they affect me and you and our community and our nation and our whole world. And this is the reality where we have our main home at the moment, this world. Is where we live it out. So live in the world. Pay your bills, cut your lawn, do the housework, vote, eat, drink, all that stuff. Do that. It's a good gift from God, apart from maybe the bills. But know that our main, deeper home is in God's kingdom. And if your heart is there, it will inevitably affect how you live in this world, because you'll want this world to be more like that one. You won't escape to it. You'll say, I need this world to change because this world isn't right. It needs to be the same as God's kingdom of hope and joy and peace and love. So live in this real world here. Love it and care for it and nurture it. But know that our main, deeper, spiritual home is the kingdom. This world may not understand or comprehend that. But that's where our heart is. That's where our home is. And let that filter out into our lives here and change things the way we live now. In the main Sunday morning, in the real life, we're going to spend a bit of time in prayer now. And I'm going to encourage people to pray and ask God, what are you saying to me? How can I have the mind of Christ? How can I have God's perspectives as I live my life? The world will tell me one thing and the world lives in a certain way. But how can I have God's perspective on that? What difference would that make to me in the way I live and to my friends, to my family and to my neighbours and to the world? And ask in our prayers. And I suggest you spend a few moments now to do that yourself. Ask that you too will have the mind of Christ. So God bless.